Indigenous women, we've got an Indigenous perspective on early childhood, but I think people often oversimplify that and saying there's a pan-Indigenous perspective and fail to take into account the complexities and the multiplicities of that perspective.
So what do you mean by pan-Indigenous perspective? What does that mean?
Well, maybe more of a universal perspective. So this is where we need to look at individual communities being different from each other, not only across Australia but within, and also individuals are quite different from each other in their perspectives. But I think that there are some boundaries around perspectives that most Indigenous people share, such as connections to land and their clan group and their kin, and also the struggle around self-determination and addressing the effects of colonialism within the preschool sector as well.
Talking about the different communities is something that, you know, having recently just moved back, having moved to WA, then having returned to Victoria, being a Kamilaroi woman, it really shows the differences in each community. And people often talk about in the context of your community. And sometimes, like you've said before, everyone's got, oh no, this is the Indigenous perspective, it must be the same everywhere, but it's not. And it is really about pulling apart the layers of each community and what is important, what is relevant, is very different to each community. And that's, I think people really need to look at that, the layers for each community. Are you from an urban community? Are you from way out in desert community? And what are the issues that impact? And obviously, though, there are similarities too. People often see images on TV about what's happening always in remote communities and not realising that some of our communities in urban areas face the same issues and have the same needs, and that our children have the same needs as the children in remote communities.
That's right, but they look a little different in Melbourne than they do in Darwin. But the issues, the underlying issues are the same. Yeah, that's right.
So being open to the fact that there is diversity within our communities and that we do travel right around the country, around the world, and being aware of that is something I think that people need to, and not be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
Isn't it? If you don't ask, you don't find out, you don't get any feedback or any knowledge, and it's always better to ask the question, or to ask questions than to not know, to stand back and make those assumptions and to go with those traditional views of this is what you look like, this is what you.
Yeah, I think people need to be mindful when they're asking the questions, though, to frame them in a way that isn't racist, basically.
Yes.
I think we've all had the experience of people saying things like, oh, how Aboriginal are you, or how far back does it go, or you don't look Aboriginal, you know, those sort of questions, statements are insensitive and inappropriate.
And knowing that, for example, people say, oh, well, if you must be part Aboriginal, oh, so you don't have language, or and people just make that assumption that you're not knowing any of your cultural background either. When actually we are a source of knowledge that our elders and our aunties and our families pass on.
That's exactly
to us.
right.
And like you say, that respect of asking those questions and how do you frame.
And that, I think that also brings into about the identity and how important it is for our children to have a positive self-identity about being Aboriginal, being Koori, you know, being proud about who their families are. And so that really impacts also on the sorts of resources and the program that that we want for our children in the early childhood sector.
Another way of, I suppose, expressing the worldview is through painting, and especially with what I do and travelling and going to many countries and speaking, I tend to do my speaking through painting. So I depict a story by painting it. And this is, as you know, this has been done by Aboriginal people for thousands and thousands of years. And there are painters in our family. I've chosen to go on and do painting, but it's my being, it's within me. So if I get a thought or an idea, some people use words, some people use songs, some people use dance to express how they're feeling and thinking. I tend to put it on either material or paint it or draw it out. And that's my way of expressing some of my theories or my thoughts and my feelings within me. And hopefully this will be appreciated too by others.
I've started like a little registered a business, Imprints Inspiration Innovation, and that I've based on, like what are the imprints we leave behind, what are the imprints that we leave while we're here, who are we leaving those for, how do we inspire others, or where do we get our inspiration from, and when things need to be changed, how innovative are we, how flexible are we when we're working with children to change things, or working with a different group of people, and because they're the kind of things that have helped me to grow, those things. And I'm working under that now on a thing called Coolaman tracks, because the Coolaman is, the thing what babies, were carried in. And so I'm using the Coolaman as a thing like, how we carry our babies, our children, and how we also carry our knowledge and carry ourselves. So how do we nurture this? So, I'm calling it Coolaman tracks. So I try to, when I'm working around things to do with children now, if I'm working under that thing, that I work under that, and I think it helps people to see where they're coming from too. Doesn't matter who we are, like if we're thinking from that, like that, how we nurture, because I think it's about we hold it closer to ourselves, and I think that's what's important about our work in early years, is we do, like if you're passionate and committed and, really take notice of what is it about the early years framework, then you will carry that close to you, and so your practice needs to not only be a practice professionally, it needs to be a practice personally as well. And sometimes that gets hard, but like we need to remember that Coolaman, and I think it's a good, I'm using that as a thing that helps me to grow from here.
Early years learning framework is like reading the bush. In that metaphor, it's sort of looking at early years learning framework and using the early years learning framework in a way that I see it in my own perspective or Indigenous perspective, and how do I relate, or how do I fit into the outcome there. So for me to understand how I fit or how do I relate is to understand what sort of things that I've had through my experience as a Yolngu person, that's an Indigenous person from East Anamgapuya. So for me to pass on that knowledge and using the EYLF's learning framework is looking at like reading the bush. So when I've got my kids or the kids that I'm working with, and working with staff or working with other colleagues is that I can use the knowledge that it's already is there, and people understand that. So if I say early as learning frame is reading the bush, we say, looking at their safety and the landmarks. And I might say to my kids or kids that I'm working, I might say to them, oh, you have to dig up that hole because that's where you get the spring water from. And then you see, the story about, crocodile dreaming out there. And then you say, you can't cross that river because there's a lot of crocodiles. You have to go through this way because you can see where it is. And then you can point to them. Oh, you can't sit under this tree because if you sit here, you might get get some kind of sickness there. So all this knowledge we passed on to the kids while they're growing up and going out to hunting and showing them the landmarks and trees and rocks and the importance and the stories that comes from that place. They are growing up with that knowledge and they're growing up with our stories. And we know that they're going to be a strong Yolngu person at the end because they are all painted with these skills. They're painted with these stories, and they know that to be a Yolngu person, you have to survive in the bush and you have to know where to go, which way to go. And the outcome that we see is to have a strong knowledge to participate in ceremonies and dances, to know how your kinship works, how you relate to that other person. And at the same time, how do you, where you come from, how do you relate to that country, or how do you, it's sort of like learning about your family, now kinship, and also learning about the land, and that's how we see it. Having all that knowledge and the language itself, and then you feel proud, and you have identity as a Yolngu person. But looking at a Western perspective, it's a similar idea, but and having a same goal, but looking at in a different lens, looking at different way that Western ideas understand. And I think GPS is the same idea, but people use it in a different way. So GPS tells you where to go, how do you get to that place, and which way you go. How do you, where do you go to buy your, groceries, or where do you go for best coffee in town, or how do you go to the school or meetings where you're talking about health and well-being or mental health for kids, because it's part of learning and part of that journey that you having and getting yourself involving as an educator to get that knowledge to help your kids. And then you have your kids in your car and you say, I'm taking you to school today because you know that there'll be, in school there's a lot of there's education that that education and that support that you might have from parents and from the teachers, and that relationship there, it helps your kids grow strong, confident, and respect, they have respect for themselves because they can see, you know, safe side of it, you know. And in the childcare centers where it's you're thinking about self-safety and health hygiene, and similar idea from, you know, reading the bush. And we go to the same, you know, goal, same outcome, but we see ourselves, how do I fit into that earliest learning framework? What the outcome, where do I fit into that outcome? And that's how I see what earliest learning framework is, because it's up to us as educators to guide our kids in a way that we experience it every day in our lives. And to interpret what earliest learning framework is it's easier, like from my perspective, from the way that I see it, easier to interpret that earliest learning framework is to see two different perspectives and see the same outcome, but how do we get there?